This is Demetria Spinrad.
And this is Isaac Meyer.
And you're listening to Criminal Records Podcast, a podcast about some of the weirdest cases in true crime history. And we have a first on this podcast today. I found a case so weird and so complicated that I felt like one episode just was not enough time to do it justice. I kept trying to condense this into one episode, and all of the funniest facts kept getting cut out for time because there are so many players and so much going on. So I'm actually going to do this one as a two-parter. So the first part is going to lead up to a legal proceeding that is actually not a criminal trial, but it is a very fascinating and strange legal proceeding. And then number two is going to be not just a trial, but a little bit of a murder mystery.
Yeah, this is something we've talked about doing for a while now on this show, is having two-part episodes, working with multi-parters. And this is our first try because every time Demetria talks about this or has talked about it during the research process, it sounds increasingly insane, and I just wouldn't want any of you to miss. I don't even know how to characterize this. I guess you can find out for yourself in a few minutes. So let us know what you think as we kind of try this out, see how it works. There's certainly plenty of other areas where we could apply this approach as well. Yeah.
If this experiment goes well, we can get into some of the organized crime stories like Murder Incorporated. We've been talking for literal years about wanting to do that one, but the sheer scope of crimes that have to be covered is so massive that an hour would even a dry recounting of the facts of something like that takes more than an hour. So doing bigger, more expansive multi-parters will help us bring you some even weirder cases.
And speaking of weird, you have been teasing me with this craziness long enough. Let's go. Tell me a story.
All right. So your sexy poetry crimes from Ovid inspired me to go in search of my own sexy poetry crimes. So this time, our poet is not the criminal. Instead, our poet is going to be the victim of murder. So we are talking about the conspiracy to murder a man named Sir Thomas Overbury, a poet who some say got knocked off because of a poem he wrote.
Was he just that bad of a poem?
I've read parts of the poem and I was having a hard time finding the full poem. It's more about what he was attempting to use the poem to do, but I'm going to be honest, I'm not a fan of the poem itself.
I see. I mean, I have strong feelings about poetry criticism, but I wouldn't say they're that strong. So I'm glad to hear that there's something else going on here.
So before we can even get into what this poem was about, we are going to have to set the scene for a tale of intrigue, infidelity, and maybe poisoned enemas.
What? You can't just drop that and move on.
Oh boy, I'm going to drop a whole lot in this episode, and I'm going to have to move on because we got a lot of crazy shit to cover.
Okay.
All right. So let's go back to the very early 1600s to the court of King James I. And before I go any further into this, I want to say that the bulk of information for this episode comes from the book Unnatural Murder, Poison at the Court of James I by Anne Somerset. There's some supplementation from other sources as well. I'll make sure to link all my sources in the show notes as usual. Some of the sources disagree on the exact date when certain things happened, probably because the trial records themselves, for reasons that will get into in great detail, are quite inconsistent. And some of the correspondence from this period was A, not written for clarity, and B, interpreted by people who had a certain story that they wanted to tell. So I have also, in addition to using the date that seemed closest to right for some of these events, I am going to go ahead and keep the major players' names consistent throughout this episode. Some of them go through a lot of name changes because in England at this period, as they were granted titles, or in the cases of women, as they got married, their names would actually change. That makes a really confusing narrative to follow in an audio format. So just so you know, there are some things I'm fudging just a tiny bit for clarity in audio format. You may find different names and different dates if you go and search for this around the web. But the craziest facts remain consistent, and that's what I'm very excited about telling you about today. So let's go ahead and set the scene in King James's court. And let me very quickly digress to talk a little bit about who King James is, because I don't think we've done any cases set in his day yet.
We did his boy Charlie, but very little on old Jimmy.
Oh boy, there's so much on old Jimmy. So James the Sixth of Scotland, who goes on to become James the First of England and also of Ireland, which is a dependent kingdom of England at this time, is the first English king in the Stuart line. He's actually the cousin of Queen Elizabeth I of England, who never married and died without an heir. And that's how James ends up being the arguable monarch of three different kingdoms. That's why those are sort of separate countries, but they have the same king. So by the time James becomes King of England in 1603, he has got a lot of practice at being a monarch. He has been on the Scottish throne since 1567, when he was just 1 year old. So he has had a pretty wild upbringing for a king. There's been quite a lot of fighting over who gets to control the boy king. His own mother has kind of a sticky situation going on with her own control of her own son. So James grows up in a pretty weird situation. And let's just say he doesn't end up getting that great an education in governance. He has some flaws as a king, to put it lightly. However, he does think of himself as a scholar. He is a very big patron of the arts. This is also the King James of the King James version of the Bible. That's something that he has commissioned to have translated into English, which is a very big deal at the time. So keep that in mind as you go through the episode, not because the King James Bible is going to be that relevant to the story, but because the more you learn about King James, the funnier it is going to be that the King James version of the Bible is treated as such a crucial religious text, because that is a man who did not live biblically in all things.
I mean, the phrase "he fancied himself a scholar" has big "I read the articles on Wikipedia" energy, so I can't wait to see where this goes.
Yeah, James, the famous line about James is that he was the wisest fool in Christendom, and some people will push back against that, but let's just say James does not come out of this particular story looking like a genius. But he did like to present himself as an expert in a lot of fields, and he actually wrote a fair number of books himself, in addition to having a lot of books commissioned. He writes books on everything from good governance to demonology. James actually had a particularly intense fascination and fear of magic and witches since a 1590 scandal in which he came to believe that witches put a hit out on him and his new queen by sending storms to sink their boat as they were traveling across the sea. So for the rest of his life, he has this intense fear that witches are out to get him personally, and that only his status as a man of God is protecting him from demonic attacks by his enemies. James's fascination with witchcraft actually kicked off a whole craze for witch trials in Scotland when he was King of Scotland. And the thing about Scotland and England during this period is that when you start hunting witches, it's pretty easy to find a lot of witches.
It's almost like it's some kind of metaphorical witch hunt.
Not just a metaphorical witch hunt, a quite literal witch hunt. So let's explain the status of witchcraft in this period. King James does talk a good game about demonology, but a whole lot of his nobles are willing to associate with men and women who claim to be able to do magic. So it might help to explain that this is an era where the metaphysical understanding of the world was a bit different. Astrology was considered not just a legitimate science, but something you actually had to get a license from the College of Physicians in London in order to practice properly. So you could actually get dinged for being an unlicensed astrologer. There were also wizards, who were often referred to as cunning men, or in women's cases, cunning women, who were just the kind of people that you might want to go to for help with both your physical body and your romantic affairs. Cunning men might practice a lot of arts that we don't have scientific proof of today, like divination and necromancy, but they also probably knew a thing or two about poisons. As we've seen in some of our previous episodes, some of what these guys shilled as poisons, like magical mind-controlling ointments, were pure bunk by modern standards. But there were other substances in circulation, like mercury and arsenic, that cunning men did have access to and make use of. Sometimes for nefarious purposes, but also sometimes for medicinal purposes. This is an age of medicine that heavily favors making patients bleed, vomit, and get diarrhea to clear out their systems. So the difference between killing you and curing you can be a very fine line in this era, and doctors may have access to quite a lot of poison. So if you, like James, have aligned yourself against witchcraft as a concept, the witches actually do have a way of killing you, just not necessarily with what we today would consider magic.
That seems like maybe then not a group of people I would want to anger terribly. I mean, it seems like a lot could go wrong there for you.
It seems like a lot could go wrong there, but also James is in a really sticky situation here for very complicated reasons. So, contrary to popular belief, the medieval era wasn't really the prime time for witch hunting in England. The early modern era is when witch trials really start popping off. And there are a lot of theories that we'll get to at the end of the episode about why they start popping off in this era. But religion in these times isn't a faith in the way we think of it today. It's a whole metaphysical view of the world that's very heavily tied into scientific thought. So the thing about Catholicism, which was in Western Europe the dominant religion for the vast majority of the Middle Ages, Catholicism actually does a pretty good idea of interpreting certain types of folk magic into its worldview in the form of things like saintly miracles. I know that a lot of modern Catholics would disagree, but there are some historians who argue that part of the reason that Christianity does such an excellent job of spreading throughout Europe is it's actually a religion that does a very good job of wrapping up local pagan and folk traditions into the practice of Christianity, at least Catholic Christianity. But then comes Protestantism. And Protestantism has a very different relationship with the concept of sainthood and miracles. And so pious Protestants, and James is a Protestant, James is not a Catholic, are supposed to be abhorring black magic, and cunning men and women actually can be prosecuted in England at this time if authorities choose to do so. So this is the complicated situation that James and his nobles in England find themselves in. On one hand, James's nobles are supposed to be good Protestants like the king in England. On the other hand, Scotland still has a lot of Catholic nobles who haven't converted. So you have already sort of a complicated religious situation that James is finding himself in. He is both the head of the Church of England and the king of a country that is a different religion with a very different understanding of sort of the metaphysics of how the world works.
Yeah, I've played enough Crusader Kings to know this is not going to end well.
So this is what's happening in England. The English nobles they're supposed to be good Protestants, and they claim to be good Protestants, but they are still actually believing in magic as part of the way the world works. They just don't have that sort of religious justification of, a saint is doing it. So they are still willing to work with cunning men to achieve their own ends, but they don't have some of the, implicit blessing of the church to practice some of this magical thinking. At least that would be some scholars' argument. So that's one crime that James writes quite a lot about. But witchcraft is not the only crime that James is interested in. In the Basilian Doron, I have no idea if I pronounced that one right, his 1599 treatise on government, James lists sodomy as one of the many, quote, horrible crimes that you are bound in conscience never to forgive, along with other fun pursuits such as witchcraft, willful murder, incest, poisoning, and false coin.
I love that false coin is in there too.
Well, I mean, it's actually that's a really huge crime against the state.
Yeah, no, it makes sense. As we all know, inflation is a major issue. Unlike, well, I guess poisoning's also, and murder is not great either. But, just a lot of conflation of some very different things there.
So, in case you missed our many earlier episodes on the history of sodomy laws in England, thanks to King Henry VIII, prosecuting buggery, aka sodomy, falls wholly under the legal control of the state, not church courts, as they previously had when England was Catholic. Although, thanks to Henry VIII, the state and the church have a very different relationship than they do in Catholic parts of Europe. So, basically, what that means is that things like sodomy, which had previously been handled by the church because it's a sin, are now under the control of the state because it's a crime. So King James is, in this particular respect, one of the rulers who the law is for thee, but not so much for me. Because James does like his gentlemen, and he certainly doesn't make a secret of letting his court know which man happens to be his favorite at any given time. So his first favorite is actually when he's 13 and he's already a king. Remember, he became a king at 1 year old. So he happens to become very enamored of an older man, a man in his 30s, who he would openly hug and kiss in front of his other courtiers. When James chooses a male favorite, that guy gets a lot of power and influence at court very quickly. And that is not necessarily a great thing for the favorite. On one hand, this is a fantastic way for a hunk to get himself a title and the ear of the king himself. On the other hand, James chooses his favorites for their looks and not so much for their political acumen. So becoming a favorite means getting rocketed up to a very risky position of massive influence over a political system that you probably don't have a great handle on as someone whose only qualifications are being a hot babe.
He's grabbing himbos and then putting them in charge of the government, essentially.
Yes, that is exactly what he is doing. And becoming the king's favorite means that you are drawing the attention of scandalized nobles who very much would like to see you banished from power. That's actually what happens to James's first favorite, Esme Stuart, who James makes the first Duke of Lennox, Lord Great Chamberlain, and first Gentleman of the Bedchamber. That is a huge amount of power for a guy whose qualifications are being cute and impressing a 13-year-old. Esme gets himself caught in a sticky situation with the Scottish nobility, who hate him so much that they force young James to banish him. Esme dies shortly after his banishment, leaving James his own embalmed heart as a final gift.
That's creepy.
It's kind of a sad story, although, in fairness, Esme did really get himself into a bad political situation. So James understandably takes this loss pretty hard. Although courtiers continue to gossip about all the men who, quote, lie in his chamber and are his minions, unquote, it takes him a while to sort of look for a new favorite. During this time, he marries Anne of Denmark, but the couple actually spend a lot of their time living apart. After he becomes King of England, James ends up with a couple of favorites who everyone knows get a huge amount of his attention and favors, but then a new man catches his eye. Robert Carr is the son of a longtime supporter, not just of James, but of its first lover, Esme, the Duke of Lennox. James takes young Robert into his household in 1603 to serve as a page and then as groom of the bedchamber. That's more of a literally making the bed job than a being bedded job, but it is a very high status job because you get to spend a lot of time around the king and you get a lot of chances to impress him. By 1607, Robert is 20-ish and he is a total babe with a, quote, fair complexion, equally sharing the beauty of both sexes. James did like him a little bit androgynous. He's given the honor of presenting a painted shield to the king at a jousting tournament, but his horse rears just as he's trying to dismount, and he falls and he breaks his leg right in front of the king. And James immediately loses interest in this tournament that's being held in his own honor because he is so deeply concerned about this sexy guy's broken leg. He visits him so often during his convalescence that all the other courtiers start joking about how all this time they should have wished to break their own legs in front of the king to get attention. So it is very obvious to everybody at court what James is doing here. When Robert recovers, James makes no secret of showering him with money and status. He gets a knighthood, a promotion to gentleman of the bedchamber, and he gets a cash allowance to be paid from men in rent arrears to the crown. This was something that James actually did a lot. The crown had quite a lot of debts it was attempting to call in, and what he would say is that instead of paying this back to the crown, you have to pay this back to whatever noble I'm trying to give money to. James, by the way, extremely bad with money.
Color me shocked.
But he does also take some land away from a Catholic to give to Robert. So Robert now has his own land. He even uses a legal technicality to yoink an estate away from a son of Sir Walter Raleigh to give to Robert Carr. And then a little while later, because James is so colossally bad with managing money and land, he actually has to pay him £20,000 to take it back because he needs to give it to his own son. So yeah, James really, really not good with money. And this is...
You know, if I didn't know any better, I would say that hereditary monarchy sounds like a terrible idea.
Yeah, it turns out that just because you've been king since the age of 1 doesn't mean that you're a good king. So, yeah, James's court is getting increasingly lavish, even more so than the court of Elizabeth. Fashions are getting more expensive. Courtiers have to spend more money to keep up with these trends and have these very, very elaborate, expensive wardrobes. And James is very free with handing out money to people he likes instead of, actually paying off the debts the crown really should be paying. So all of that money that James is showering on Carr gets paid back in a lot of personal attention. Carr spends a lot of time hunting with him and sleeping in his bedchamber. He also becomes the person who's sort of like James's secretary. All of James's correspondence when he's off on these hunting trips passes through him. So Carr has a tremendous amount of power over what the king sees and how he sees it, basically how he hears about the news. But for all this status, Carr remains unpopular at court. His Scottish heritage and his very strong Scottish accent are not winning him any favors in the English court. And even at James's very debauched court, and we're talking really debauched. I mean, people are having affairs openly all over the place at this court. There are still plenty of moralizers who think the king's habit of publicly kissing and hanging on his male favorites is over the line. So female favorites, that's fine. And James does briefly have a female mistress as well. That's fine. That's cool. But male favorites, that's a step too far for some people. But Robert does manage to make one very good friend at court, and that is a man named Thomas Overbury. So Overbury is a well-educated and well-traveled gentleman that Robert has actually known since he was a teenager in Scotland. Thomas is not a particularly popular man at court himself. He is known to be extremely arrogant, and his friendship with Robert only makes him more arrogant because it makes him believe that he has power. And worse, he is the kind of hypocrite who lives large, but disdains the same kind of lifestyle in other people. So he is this very stuck-up person who's just going around court, pissing everybody off. Thomas Overbury fancies himself a poet and a satirist. He writes some character sketches lampooning vain courtiers and praising innocent widows and rustic milkmaids. What a charmer. Can't figure out any reason why he might have some trouble making friends at court.
I mean, a little workshop for you, buddy. That's kind of the low-hanging fruit, I feel like. Can we try and be a little more original than making fun of the debauched courtiers? Let's spice this up a little bit. Let's try and do something new.
So for all his social faults, Robert Carr not only likes him, he takes advice from him. Whether they were anything closer than friends is a matter of some debate at court. Some courtiers do think that Overbury and Carr are sleeping together. And King James hates Overbury. And Overbury, in his turn, believes that the king despises him because Carr loves him better. So up for some interpretation here, whether this is just three guys who are incredibly bad at politics, giving each other kind of a triangle of very bad advice, or if there's a love triangle happening here. Your call on that one.
Yeah, I mean, I want to believe it's the love triangle just for maximum sauciness, but
So, in spite of all this hatred, King James does knight Overbury, probably because Carr insists on it. And Overbury also gets some property that had been seized by the crown. He gets a position as a server to the king, and he gets some favors for his family members as well. But despite this increasing closeness to the king, James never really does warm up to Overbury, but he keeps giving Carr more and more power. By 1608, Carr is pretty directly involved not just in the king's pleasures, but the king's business. He handles the king's correspondence, which often passes through Overbury to get to him. So Overbury is getting all this correspondence. He summarizes it for Carr. Carr summarizes it for the king. So Overbury has a lot of power to present whatever correspondence the king is receiving in a light that is favorable to him. Carr is actually so directly involved in the affairs of state that he gets in the middle of a quarrel between the king and parliament in 1610. So remember, the king has power in England, but he does not have absolute power. There is the parliament that is supposed to be checking him. And in this case, the parliament's going, hey, James, buddy, you are spending so much more than you're making. Could you maybe slow down a little bit? And Carr gets in the middle of this. And of course, Carr is, incentivized to have the king keep spending money on him. So he doesn't really make the situation better.
Well, fortunately, we all know from our study of English history, there will be no lingering impacts of these financial problems. It's not like they're going to trigger a revolution that will overthrow and decapitate his son or anything.
Oh, this is not actually even the only son that Carr is eventually going to be accused of having a hand in the death of. Literally everything you say, I'm like, oh, something even weirder happens.
How did the English manage to conquer so much of the world? I just have so many questions.
But Carr basically gets in the middle of this conflict between the king and parliament, and he convinces James that there's a fight brewing between the Commons and the Scots. And James gets so worked up about this that he actually decides to dissolve Parliament. And I don't think there's another session of Parliament until 1614, and even then, it's kind of a disaster. So
That
really, James
sounds about right.
James is not getting his advice from a guy who has his best interests at heart here.
Color me shocked that the royal himbo is not providing the best advice.
The royal himbo is not providing the best advice for James, but he's providing great advice for him, because he actually comes out of this rocky political period many thousands of pounds richer. He's made a Knight of the Garter, and he gets raised to the peerage thanks to the king's continuing generosity. So he is now Viscount Rochester. He's the first Scot who gets his own seat in the English House of Lords. So obviously, at this point, Carr is very heavily involved in the financial affairs of the state. And Overbury is directly involved in feeding advice to Carr about who should be promoted to important positions. So the two of them actually have a great grift going. So Carr is willing to recommend people to the king for important court promotions so long as they pay him first. And these come with very steep fees from Carr. And Overbury is involved in this scheme of basically shaking down people for promotions. A lot of very important people grudgingly pay up, but it does not win Carr a lot of friends at court. So while Carr is consolidating his power and expanding his list of enemies, Queen Anne is getting more and more cheesed off at him. It's a little unclear if she's actually jealous of him as a rival for the king's attention. She was kind of off doing her own thing and maybe quite happy to be doing that. But she also doesn't really love the fact that she is losing out on her influence over the king, because Carr is really honing in on what should be her own ability to promote her own family and friends at court. It doesn't help that Overbury has always been insolent to the queen, and Carr starts behaving the same way. So he now believes that he is so untouchable at court that he can just go in there and insult the queen. And in 1611, Queen Anne goes on the attack. The details of why she gets pissed off at Overbury and Carr aren't recorded exactly. Apparently, she looks out her window at the two of them walking in a garden, and she sees them doing something that absolutely enrages her. Some versions of the story say they're laughing amongst themselves, and she becomes convinced that they're laughing at her. Another version of the story says that there's some kind of faux pas with one of them refusing to doff his hat at the queen, and one does not refuse to doff one's hat to the queen.
I am shocked, frankly.
She manages to have Overbury briefly banished from the court, although James refuses to do the same to Carr. So the king's wife, the queen, is saying, please banish this guy from court. And James is saying, I don't want to do that. So some marital discord there. Overbury is eventually allowed back at court months later, but only if he stays out of the queen's sight. So a smarter man than Overbury would realize that he's really worn out his welcome here, but Overbury is, in this regard, not a very smart man. So while all of this has been going down, Carr's attention has been captured by someone new, and this time it's a lady. The king's favorite has been cozying up to the unhappily married Lady Frances Howard, the Countess of Essex. Frances, for her part, is taking an active part in seducing Carr with magic. Frances's friend, Anne Turner, helps her consult with Dr. Foreman, who is a physician and a magician who promises that he will help her win the love of Robert Carr.
That's how they get you.
Frances is pretty indiscreet about writing to Dr. Foreman about her intentions. We know this because when he dies in September 1611, his widow hangs on to a few incriminating letters, despite Anne Turner attempting to sort of get all the letters that Frances sent back. And those letters are eventually going to come out at trial, so we actually do have some records of what she was writing there. So whether by magic or just her regular charm, she was apparently quite a babe herself. Frances Howard and Robert Carr do manage to hook up. But they do so while Frances is still married to her first husband. So now, all Frances has to do is get out of her unsatisfactory marriage so she can get married to the hot, rich, influential Viscount that she snagged. Now, there is a problem here, and that problem is Thomas Overbury really doesn't want this match to be successful. Overbury has a history of beefing with Frances. He doesn't like Frances so much. And not just Frances. The whole Howard family has gotten on his bad side. So the Howards are a family at court who are attempting to wield their own influence over the king. And Overbury doesn't want them honing in on, basically his meal ticket.
This seems like such a healthy basis for so many relationships. Yeah, like, slap a relationship counselor into a time machine and send them back here. I think you clean up so many issues.
So Overbury is a bit panicked, understandably panicked, at the fact that his best friend, maybe lover, and meal ticket is going to be marrying into a family that hates him and would love to cut him out of, influence over the king. Overbury actually, this is the weird part, Overbury is actually not only cool about, but actually encouraging of his friend seducing Frances. He would love to have the Howards discredited by having Frances have a very obvious affair with somebody. But when Robert Carr starts talking about actually wanting to marry Frances, that is what makes Overbury nervous. So, to stop this budding romance, Overbury is willing to make his point in verse. He writes a poem called A Wife that is meant to discourage Carr from making a match. So what A Wife does is it's basically explaining what an ideal life is supposed to be like in such a way that it's very, very clear that it is a dig at Frances because she is not any of these things. So
this is like the end of a weird Broadway play. Like, don't get married. Let me explain to you why with my poem. It's like that's like one stop short of let me explain to you why with my musical number.
So, as weird as this sounds, this is also sort of the era of the explosion of things like the printing press. And as I'll in the second part, I will read out some poetry I found, not by Overbury. Overbury's poetry I don't like so much. But a popular poem that circulated at court could actually legitimately humiliate someone. So there's some incentive here to Overbury thinks he's a wit. He thinks he's a satirist. So it sort of makes sense that he decides to deliver this message in verse. So although Overbury is well educated himself, the poem is about how men shouldn't pursue educated women, since all that book learning is only going to distract her from her good wifely duties.
Oh, whoops.
Sorry, man, you married the wrong woman. I am terrible at my wifely duties.
Yeah, it's all those books you read, you know?
The poem goes on to say that women's purity should be undeniable, and that any woman who's even being approached by other men should be considered suspicious because a really good wife is so obviously pure that no man would try to seduce her, knowing that he'd be shot down. So Overbury has convinced his friend to seduce Frances, and then he says, you shouldn't marry her because you were able to seduce her. And the fact that you even thought about seducing her means that she's not marriage material.
This is some fucking Mean Girl shit right here.
So on one side, you've got Overbury, who's gotten very comfortable with meddling in the affairs of his extremely powerful friend, Robert Carr. And on the other side, you have the Howards, who are already pissed off at Overbury for inserting himself into a different political situation involving Frances's great uncle. And this seems like a great way for them to get even more favor at court. So Carr and Frances's father, the Earl of Suffolk, actually don't get along all that well. But getting Frances shacked up to Robert Carr would still be a winning situation for the Howards. So that gives them a way to cut off Overbury from his channel to power. It gives the Howards a way to directly influence the king's decisions via their advice to Carr. And Frances has also made it clear to her family that if they don't help her get out of this crappy marriage that she's in with her first husband, she is going to take desperate actions, magical actions. That's right. If Frances can't get herself unmarried legally, she's going to have a cunning woman deal with the situation. She actually goes out and finds a woman who says, oh yeah, I can get you out of your marriage. No problem. Just, here's some powders. Go deal with it. So Frances's dad actually catches her with some mystery powders, and he is not too pleased with the prospect of his daughter trying to end her marriage and possibly her husband's life with this poison supplied by a cunning woman.
Parents, this is why you need to have the difficult conversations around relationship boundaries and good communication. Right? You have to teach your children model effective relationship behavior and not solving your problems with poisoning.
But I'll say this in Frances's favor. Poison does seem like a pretty quick way to solve her problems because it is actually very hard to end a marriage at this time period. So she can't actually just get a divorce. You may recall the whole thing about Henry VIII and his whole divorce situation. She actually doesn't have access to that route out of her marriage. So she can't divorce. She has to annul the marriage.
Is this the part where we have to say this is not legal advice?
Please take all of the legal advice that you're about to hear. I would love to hear how that goes in court because I am about to embark on a wild story.
We can't make our own content like this. You can't meddle in the system like that.
Okay, so here's how annulment works. So In order to annul a marriage, you have to prove that that marriage was not consummated. So you have to prove that your husband is impotent. Basically, he's not able to get it up. So Frances's father and her uncle try to argue that her husband, Robert Devereux, the third Earl of Essex, has failed to successfully deflower their daughter, and thus this marriage should be annulled. Annulment is a tricky situation at this time. So this is a strata of society where marriage is more often about very wealthy men consolidating power than it is about love. There's some reasons why you don't want people to just be able to break off marriages whenever they feel like they might get a better deal somewhere else.
I would also like to remind everyone involved that this complicated political argument about whether or not a man can get a boner is taking place while everyone has to wear those weird barrister wigs and robes. Just for the record.
Actually, I think in this case they wouldn't have to wear it because this isn't actually a criminal trial. So I'm not sure there's actually a lawyer
they're just
involved here.
Wearing regular 17th century outfits. So probably some cod pieces.
They're wearing massive ruffs, and this was the time period where yellow starch on ruffs was considered the trendy thing to do. So imagine a guy with just a massive starched saucer of lace protruding from his neck, arguing about whether he can get a boner. So to annul this marriage, the king actually has to appoint a commission to investigate the situation and make a ruling. And the king is very much in favor of this marriage being annulled. He is actually not against his favorites getting married. He understands that marriage is a really important thing politically, and he wants his favorites to be in a good situation politically. And he's actually very tight with the Howard family. So Carr and the Howards buddying up is a win-win for him. He actually has been hoping for a while that Carr will make some peace with Frances's father, and them being in-laws seems like a fantastic situation for him. So, as the likelihood of this couple getting hitched for real develops, Overbury and Carr's relationship grows more strained. Overbury has too much dirt on Carr for Carr to cut him loose, but Carr likes Frances Howard too much to drop her on his now former friend's command. So, the scheme to get Overbury out of the way so that this annulment can proceed commences. Frances starts working her connections. Her first thought is that she would like to try to find a guy who might be willing to instigate a fight and kill Overbury. And she knows a lot of men who would like to beat Overbury up. I really cannot emphasize enough how unpopular this man is at court. But nobody is willing to take the rap for murder. So she finds a lot of guys who will volunteer to punch this guy in the face, but no one who's willing to punch him so hard he dies. So King James comes up with an idea. Let's offer Overbury a position as ambassador to a foreign country to get him out of the way. This is actually not the first time someone has kicked around the idea of sending Overbury off to another country as an ambassador. He is so disliked that loads of people love the idea of just packing him off to another country. Being an ambassador would technically be a promotion for Overbury, and it makes sense since he's a pretty well-educated man, but it is practically a raw deal for him. Ambassadors are actually paid a lot less than it costs to maintain a household overseas. So this is the king saying, let's give Overbury a shit job that will lose him money to get him out of the way. And James takes this a step further, because the country he settles on sending Overbury off to is Russia. And if you know a thing or two about Russia in the 1600s, not a great place for an Englishman to hang out.
Oh my god, this is basically just the Connor Roy subplot from the most recent season of Succession. He's annoying, let's make him go away by making him an ambassador.
So when the king commands you to be an ambassador, you are not supposed to turn the gig down, even if the king is clearly trying to get you out of the way by sending you off to Russia. But Overbury refuses the king's oh-so-generous offer. First, he pretends that he's too bad at learning languages to go. Then he starts saying that he's too ill to go. And finally, he's run out of excuses, and he says, you know what? I just really do not want to go to Russia.
Your Majesty, I just really don't like beets.
And this gives James an excuse to arrest him and lock him in the Tower of London. Now, locking Overbury up for months for pissing off the king is actually not technically legal. Overbury actually does have constitutional privileges, and making the king mad is in itself not a crime. But he is so unpopular that nobody is willing to go to bat for his freedom. So, mission accomplished. Overbury is out of the way, and the annulment of Francis's marriage can proceed without interruption. And oh, what a legal proceeding this is going to be. England is supposed to have a law stating that marriages can be annulled due to a man's impotence. But they have been trying for over 50 years to officially pass this law, and they have not managed it. So there isn't actually a clear legal code of how you annul a marriage. And of course, this has gotten even more complicated because the complications of switching legal authority over marriage from the Catholic Church to the newfangled Protestant church-state fusion situation means that a lot of previous precedent about how marriage works was handled by the church, and it no longer is. So you're dependent on a common law situation when you've thrown out a bunch of the previous common law. So do you see how this gets weird?
This is heinously messy.
So Francis's husband, actually, he does not like his wife very much. And it's a little bit unclear, actually, if he genuinely was impotent or if he was refusing to sleep with her because he didn't like her, or if he specifically couldn't get it up with her either because she was just really insulting to him, or what was going on in the bedchamber. But he actually, even though he really doesn't like Francis, he has a really strong reason to fight for this marriage, because under the current mismatch of law, there is a risk that if his marriage is dissolved, any future marriages of his will not be legal.
Because he's been found to be impotent.
He's found to be impotent, but it is also legally unclear if Francis is still his wife or not, even if the marriage is annulled. So if he ever remarries a second wife and he does successfully have sex and he does get her pregnant, that proves that he was never impotent, and he has to take his first wife back, which means that the heir that he does manage to sire would be illegitimate.
Oh my God.
Yeah. Do you see how absolutely bonkers it is that England has managed to completely throw out so much of its precedent about how marriages works, and it's still it is building the plane as it flies here.
You know, probably should have thought that one a little bit more through as you were kind of... it just seems like making sure you can have a legitimate heir, that's pretty high on the priority list. Now, I would expect that to be towards the top of the towards the top of the revisions that are getting made as you push your legal code out of beta.
Well, Isaac, I have great news for you. And that is that the Howards think that they have found a loophole.
Oh, God.
And that loophole is saying that a witch did it.
You know what? Fair enough.
So if the husband is cursed by a witch, that might mean that he is impotent with one woman, but he is not impotent overall. So if your wife doesn't make your penis hard, but you can still get it up for other ladies, that is because of a witchcraft. And this is the legal strategy that the Howards are going to take for this commission.
Question. Can we start using this for precedents we don't like in the United States? Bush v. Gore, don't like it, witch did it.
Common law, baby.
Yeah, you know what? It's technically precedent. All right, we're taking it to the Supreme Court.
So this is the argument that the Howards are taking for the commission. You have to annul this marriage because a witch cursed this man's penis. Francis can try again with an uncursed penis belonging to Robert Carr. The Howards are going ahead with this argument, But Francis's husband, again, because the law is so complicated that he is unsure if he's going to be able to legally marry again if he gets this annulment, he's trying to fight this. And his counter argument is, I can totally get my penis hard. And he, at one point, even lifts up his shirt in front of some of his gentleman friends and shows them his hard penis as proof.
Well, time to sign some affidavits, gentlemen.
He does not have to do this in court, but Frances actually does have to have her genitals examined as part of this court process, because part of the process of proving that she has never had sex with her husband is having a virginity exam done. This is a now discredited process. There is no, hymens do exist, but they're not like a freshness seal over a vagina. That's not how a hymen works. You can't just sort of take a gander at someone's genitals and know for sure if they've had sex or not. But Frances is pretty nervous about this because she has been fooling around with Robert Carr. So whether or not she had sex with her husband, she has certainly been having sex with somebody. So she actually pulls a switcheroo and has one of her relatives go into the exam with a veil on that she doesn't take off, and has her relative be examined in her place. Frances is shown, according to the virginity exam, that she does not take to be a virgin. So that's evidence in her favor.
Well, I guess it's good that relative wasn't having an affair.
At one point, actually, the court is so desperate to figure out what legal precedents they are allowed to work with here that they actually go back and take a look at some of the annulment proceedings of King Henry VIII. And there is actually a legal case involving the wet dreams of King Henry VIII that they have to fall back on here, because Henry was not able to, for some reason, he was trying to get an annulment from a wife, but he was still able to have wet dreams. Therefore, he wasn't impotent. So that is the kind of common law precedent that they're working with here.
I'd just like to remind any listener who is currently in Canada or the United States that we did base our legal system off of this, and technically English precedents still have some force in our courts of law. And just, I want you to take a moment to sit with that. Like right now, just sit with that for a moment.
So at one point in these proceedings, Frances's husband and uncle go, you know what? I got a faster way to solve this one. And they flee the country because dueling is not legal in England at this period, but it is legal on the continent. So they actually try to set sail for the continent so that they can have a duel. So that, you know what? If the husband dies, easy peasy, problem solved. If the uncle dies, that's one less person arguing in favor of annulment. So they give that one a try. They actually have to get arrested and brought back. So that is not a successful answer to their problems. But while all of this is going on, Frances is concerned about whether Overbury is going to manage to get loose from the Tower of London and start trying to butt into Robert Carr's affairs again. Then she gets a piece of convenient news, because on September 15th, 1613, Thomas Overbury dies in the Tower of London. He's only 32 years old, but his death doesn't really come as that much of a surprise. His health has been deteriorating for quite a while. He's been telling the king that he is too unhealthy to serve as an ambassador. So, problem solved. Shortly after he dies, just a few days later, I think, actually, Frances finally gets her annulment. But the question we have to ask ourselves is, was the death of Thomas Overbury natural, or was it murder? Was it murder by witchcraft? Find out next time on Criminal Records Podcast.
Well, before we let everyone go, and before we can, take a break here to continue the story next time, I just want to take a moment to really say, as an idealist, I really believe in the value and the power of the law and its ability to shape our society in a positive way. And I believe those things in spite of the English and not because of them.
Yeah, I'd been really debating for a long time. I really wanted to do a witchcraft trial, and I wasn't sure which one to start with. So this is actually not a witchcraft trial. This is a legal case in which witchcraft is brought up. But in this particular case, Frances is not accused of being a witch. She's not accused of deliberately setting a witch on her husband. The witch is just sort of a thing that happened to her husband.
The classic legal precedent of a witch probably did it.
And yeah, like I said, I wanted to have just a little bit of talk at the end of the episode about what the hell is going on with witchcraft during this period. Obviously, a lot of scholars do say there's a pretty interesting argument that the end of the Catholic Church is what leads to this sudden witchcraft panic. It is true that the Catholic Church was providing a lot of social structures that in particular were looking after older widows and unmarried women. Taking away those things leaves some people kind of adrift in society. And those are, the kind of people who get accused of being witches a lot. But it is not the only theory of why all of a sudden witchcraft trials kick off so much. There are quite a few other theories that I could go into if you're interested.
Sure, let's talk witchcraft.
One of the other big ones that's quite popular these days is the climate change theory. England actually had been going, and I think the Americas too, had been going through kind of a weird climate period. There were a lot of crop failures. And some scholars actually even go a step further and say a lot of these crop failures were caused by unusually cold and wet conditions, which can lead to ergot, which is the basis from which LSD was originally synthesized to grow on crops. So if your staple grain crop, is it rye that ergot grows on or wheat?
I believe it is rye, but I'm not totally sure.
I think it's rye. Yeah, if your staple crop is contaminated by the precursor to LSD, you can start having some pretty fucking wild visions. So there could have been people who were hallucinating
just
some wild shit.
Balls.
So yeah, that's another theory. What is it? I'm trying to recall from my undergrad classes the other big ones.
I mean, the ones that I had always heard were the collapse of the church thing, and then specifically the kind of end of social services associated with the church for especially like single or older women, who otherwise in a very patriarchal society got viewed with a lot of suspicion for kind of being off on their own, away from the confines of acceptable society.
Yeah, you can see from the way James is spending money, who he's spending it on, the fact that he is seizing a lot of Catholic land and giving it to Protestants. This is a guy who's not as invested in some of those services for the poor as the Catholic Church was. So yeah, that can create a lot of problems.
Yeah, I mean, it's hard, I think, to be sure with these things. It's very hard to answer the question, why didn't something happen? Personally, I just blame the English. That's my go-to.
But yeah, it is interesting that this is a period where, I mean, the metaphysical argument that witches existed did seem sound, and there were a lot of people running around calling themselves witches who had access to poison. So, a witch could kill you. Not by cursing your penis, but a witch could kill you.
In the meantime, folks, just remember, speeding ticket, it's a common law precedent. Witch did
it. But only if your dick can't get hard. All right, where can people find us if they would like to know more about cursed penis law?
People can find us at our website, which is facingbackward.com, for more witch and or penis related crimes and other things too.
We are on Tumblr. We're Facing Backward on Tumblr, which I update irregularly, mostly with clips of my notes from upcoming episodes. So I had a delightful little preview of this one up.
You can also find us on Patreon, where a wonderful network of supporters very kindly helps financially support our addiction to talking about bizarre witch crime.
So thank you very much to our patrons who fund us as we talk about penis law.
And I'd like to give a particular shout out to those of you who have donated our shout out tier, our beloved shout out patrons. They are Jan Leonard, Stephen Elkins, Martin Oliveira, Clark Canning, Ian Kellett, Matt Haynes, Jackie Frostocker, Monkey Sack, Alayla McCulloch, Karen Murphy, Peter Wales, Robert Prine, William, Arno, Jonas Brandis, Nicholas Kroll, Jerry Spinrad, Jared Stevens, Jeffrey Dwork, Stefan Hrushka, Joshua Kane, Robbie and Cat, Jacob Key, Aaron Finkbeiner, and Anonymous Anna's Hummingbird, Mark Sai, Gil, Shimao Toshio's History of Japonesia podcast, A House is a Perfectly Cromulent Mascot, The Fish I Catch Are Rhodes Scholars, compared to Samuel Alito, who is still a schmuck, and last but not least, Everything Changed When the Fire Nation Attacked. That's like a rap that I have to do now.
Thank you so much. I mean, it's awesome that we have so many people supporting us.
Yeah, no, it's fantastic. It is kind of funny that I've done this enough times now that it's becoming like a pattern in my head where I'm just like, yeah, I know these.
So yeah, next time we will get to the actual criminal part of this true crime case. And don't worry, it only gets weirder from here.
In the meantime, folks, don't get your genitals cursed by witches. Or do. I don't kink shame.